Hello and welcome. My name is Amber Bryant, and I am the project manager for the Partnership in Expanding Education Research, PEERS, Data Hub at the University of Michigan. The PEERS Data Hub is funded by the National Science Foundation and is a collaborative initiative between the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research here at the University of Michigan. Today's webinar and panel discussion is about solutions to education data access challenges. For those of you who submitted questions via the registration link, thank you so much. Before we open up the panel discussion, I would like to share a few slides about research and data collection to help frame the conversation and to make sure we all have a shared understanding of our topic. For this webinar, we are discussing the two traditional ways of conducting research, through primary or secondary data collection and analysis. Primary data is data collected firsthand by the researcher or researchers. They are directly involved in the research collection process and have a good amount of control and input over the process as a whole when it comes to the research within some predetermined parameters. Secondary data is pre-existing data that already exists and ready for analysis. This is what we see when we think of data from NCES or data gathered and shared through other educational or government entities. There are benefits to both, of course, but in my opinion, secondary data analysis has more advantages. Primary data allows for more specificity, and you can probably directly answer or address your research questions through your research design phase by creating those variables that you would like. However, it is often time and resource intensive and not always necessary if your questions can be answered with existing data. It is important to note that funding agencies are aware of this and they encourage secondary data analysis. If there is high quality data available, it is wise to use it. You are a good steward of research and of your funding if you can use what is already there and get to the good parts of your research sooner, the analysis and the outcomes. When I say data, I truly mean the raw Excel CSV data sheets, not the tables and graphs that you produce. Data is the underlying information behind the stats, the numbers that create the charts and graphs. The statistics, which is what you're trying to get to with the data, are the digestible outputs for dissemination. It tells the story of the data, so to speak. Here is a quick visual with the statistics in the back and then the data there in the front. And a lot of times the data is or can be made available to you. So you see there the raw numbers compared to the graphs and charts and outputs, statistical outputs. PEERS is operated by ICPSR in collaboration with AERA. The data that are made available through the PEERS Data Hub are both public and restricted access, and they undergo a disclosure risk review process that ensures the identity protection of the participants in studies. Publicly available data has less vulnerable information than restricted data, plainly speaking. Restricted access data may have information that could potentially lead to re-identification of the respondents, or it may include and cover sensitive topics. Restricted data requires a more thorough application process and operates in a way to protect and preserve the confidentiality of the materials as much as possible. ICPSR houses several thematic archives that cover a range of topics. Here are a few listed on the screen. I would take a quick second to highlight a few specific data sets that have recently been released that could be of interest to you and I as education researchers. The first is our College and Beyond 2 data. College and Beyond 2 is a data resource for studying the impact and outcomes of higher education. It includes student-level data on bachelor-seeking undergraduates enrolled in 19 public institutions from approximately 2000 to 2021, and its core administrative data. For a subset of the students, College and Beyond 2 contains information about later life outcomes, including health and well-being, civic and democratic engagement, and openness to diversity. More than a decade after graduating with a bachelor's degree in its alumni survey. CB2 data are restricted use and may be made available via our virtual data enclave. There's a little bit more of an application process for these. Again, it's a restricted data source. The next one I would like to mention is the SEDA data, the Stanford Education Data Archive. The Stanford Education Data Archive includes a range of detailed data on educational outcomes, contexts, and conditions in schools and school districts across the United States. It includes data at a range of institutional and geographic levels of aggregation, including school, district, counties, commuting zones, metropolitan areas, and states. The SED 2022 data is unique from the other versions of the SEDA data. The currently available data includes district level data for subsets on an average of math and reading achievement from 2009 to 2022 respectively. And the 2022 data reports the change in that average over time. I will share links to all of these resources with you, and they are also included in the PowerPoint, which will go out with this video. Lastly, we have the Measures of Effective Teaching, the MET project, which was launched in 2009 to investigate how teacher evaluation methods can be best used to inform teachers about the skills that make them most effective and to help districts identify great teaching. Before we move to our panel, are there any questions or comments from me? Okay. Again, this PowerPoint and slide will be made available to you via the email that you used to register. In a few days, it will be sent out. All right. You can use that QR code to access the agenda, and we are going to begin our discussion. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our panelists and share the agenda with you in case you missed it. It includes the panelists' names for reference. Again, I am Amber Bryant, and I will be moderating this session. Today, we have Susan Jekalek, who is the Director of Education Archives and Associate Research Scientist here at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Susan is also a co-principal investigator for the Peers Data Hub. We have Joseph Saul, who is an adjunct research assistant professor and a privacy and security officer here at ICPSR. And yes, we are thankful to have him. We have George Wimberly, who is a representative of the American Educational Research Association. There, he's the Director of Professional Development, the Diversity Officer, and he is another co-PI for the Peers Data Hub. So thank you, George, for being with us today. And last but not least, we have Allison Flaster, who is an assistant research scientist here at ICPSR, and she is one of the co-principal investigators for the College and Beyond 2 project. So let's get started. To kick off things, I kind of want to dive a little bit more into what we all know to be an obstacle in our education research, which is the vulnerability of researching children. We often run into what is known as FERPA. Susan and Joe, would you mind just telling us a little bit about what FERPA is, what it means for us as educational researchers, and just give us a little bit more context on FERPA, how it's an obstacle for us on data access, and maybe ways that it is not. So feel free, either of you can take it away.
And so as you can imagine, as a primary data collection researcher, that you will need to go through a lot of work to, if you want to link your primary data collection to education outcomes of individuals in a data collection, you would be going through a lot of work to access the right consents to do that. On the other hand, one beneficial aspect of a number of archived data projects, and some of the projects mentioned by Amber, is that we have developed data access procedures that comply with FERPA protections. and users can request de-identified data for the purpose of doing research that informs educational practice for a few studies. We wish we could say we have all the educational administrative data. Of course, we do not. However, two particular data sets that Amber mentioned, the College and Beyond 2 is one of those data sets where users would be able to access large quantities of higher education administrative data for the students in that collection, of de-identified, of course, and for the purposes of doing educational research as well. I think Allison is going to talk a little bit more. Allison will be able to answer more questions about the details of that data. Secondly, Amber mentioned the measures of effective teaching study, which again, we have at ICPSR conducted a lot of work to develop procedures for a portion of that data that is administrative data, de-identified, linked to participants in the data collection, and gives researchers the ability to get some experience analyzing such data to answer some research questions. So with that, I will turn to Joe, to
Okay.
any other aspects of that question.
Sure. I mean, let me just lay out kind of the broad categories of data from the perspective of FERPA, right? So FERPA covers records that are directly related to a student and maintained by an educational agency or institution or someone who does it for them. So just as in the healthcare world, it's possible to have health data that's not covered by HIPAA because it wasn't collected by or under the auspices of a covered entity. It's possible to have education-related surveys and research that are done that wouldn't fall under FERPA in the first place because it wasn't part of their educational records. It wasn't generated by the schools they attended. It was instead a questionnaire sent by a third party, for example. And so that it's worth being aware of that, right? Even if you work for a university, if you were to send a questionnaire out to a group of people and ask them about their educational experiences, that wouldn't necessarily be covered by FERPA. You'd have to worry about normal human subjects type research, right? And in the United States, that means an IRB, et cetera. I do recognize that we have a number of attendees from outside the US. So I hope you'll forgive me. I can mostly only speak to US regulations on this. I also know GDPR, but so first off, we're only worried about FERPA when we're talking about data that is directly related to a student and was maintained by an educational institution or agency. Within that, there are really, two things you can look at. As Susan said, we do have, and other organizations do, help educational information that's been de-identified. The FERPA standard for de-identification is that students can't be identified from the data set. And implicitly, that's also given what other information is out there. It's both a very stringent standard and also not a very specific one. But once the data has been de-identified, it can be provided to researchers. There are no restraints under FERPA based on that, as long as the data is truly de-identified and is being used appropriately. Again, to get access to it through us, you probably do have to get an IRB determination. Though because it's de-identified, that determination is often that this is exempt and that the IRB isn't going to weigh in on it. Even Amber, are you responding to me, or your mic's off? If so, is there something?
No, I am. I'm just agreeing. I didn't know some of those things, and I was going to ask the question. So if a researcher wants to go into a fifth grade class and administer a survey, the information they gather, it doesn't have.
When they're doing it in the educational environment, I don't know where the line is. And if we want to have a follow-up discussion on this at some point, I can do some homework on it. I haven't.
Gotcha. Okay.
No one's asked me that before, but FERPA, like most federal laws, regulates a specific group of organizations, a specific. And the way it defines education records, and I'm not going to give the citation. I think I'm the only one here with a law degree, so you'd all get mad at me. But I'll read it to you. Education records. The term means those records that are, one, directly related to a student, and two, maintained by an educational agency or institution, or by a party acting for the agency or institution. And they clarify some exemptions on this.
Mhm.
And they have to do with clinical stuff or whatever, or employment records or so
Mhm.
forth. But if you do a survey and it happens to be about school experiences, and it's not being done under the auspices of the educational institution the student's attending, it wouldn't fall under this definition.
Mhm.
And that's especially
Gotcha.
true if you survey adults about what their educational experiences were, right? Like if the Gates Foundation sends out a survey, that the results of that survey won't fall under FERPA.
Right. Gotcha.
So
So yeah, it
yeah,
makes a lot of sense. I think where education researchers kind of fall into or run into the FERPA issue is that we want the administrative records.
of
We're
course.
typically trying to look for their outcomes and their scores. And, so so that is, I think that's the place where we probably hit it.
And those absolutely are.
Mhm.
Okay. And the only way to get them out from under that is to de-identify them.
Okay. Gotcha.
But there is another point that I want to make, and I don't know. For those of you who haven't worked with me, my background isn't in research.
Gotcha.
It's in privacy and
And
security.
security. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but so there are things that might be common knowledge in the field that I don't know, but I'm happy to learn. I'm happy to help. Look, they can disclose identifiable student records with personally identifiable information in PII for research if the research, and I'm going to just read the literal language here, I'm not going to summarize it like we usually do when we're talking about it. The disclosure must be for or on behalf of an educational agency or institution in order to develop, validate, or administer predictive tests, to administer student aid programs, those are both pretty narrow, or to improve instruction. So FERPA does allow access
Gotcha.
to student records with PII if it's being done under the auspices of an educational organization and the purpose is improvement of instruction.
Gotcha.
So for a subset of research projects, it is plausible to use fully identifiable information. Now, I would assume you only do that if you need it, and the institution only grants it if you actually need the more identifiable data. But yeah, it is similar to GDPR. It is.
Gotcha.
Yeah, PII, of course, is personally identifiable information. Thanks for putting that also in writing there, Maggie. So the short version of this is you can do research without worrying about FERPA if you're doing a survey that you're not hitting educational records. You're collecting data directly from the subject, right? And analogously, that works in healthcare too. You can use data for research that's covered by FERPA if you get it de-identified, which means it's not anymore. Or you can use data for research that's covered by FERPA and has PII in it if you're doing research, to validate predictive tests, administer, or research to improve instruction, which to my mind is actually pretty broad. I mean, I don't encourage people to ethically push the boundaries of that, but it's a legit research purpose for many people. And if you do need identifiable information, or if you need records that you don't need the identifiers, but the data only exists in identifiable form, then that's what then you can use that exemption if your research fits in that category. And we see it with CB2.
Okay, good.
Restrictions are built into CB2's legal documents.
Okay, gotcha. And like Susan mentioned, Allison will be discussing that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I've worked on the legal agreements related to CB2 with Allison. I'm not gonna steal Allison's thunder.
I'm sure she'll be open to
She
any
knows
inputs
it way better than I do. So
Yes, understood. Yeah, I appreciate that response. I learned a lot, and I hope you stick around just in case we have a few more questions about that
yeah,
for you.
I'm good.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So in that same vein, we're gonna move to kind of what data is looking like right now, data trends in education right now. George, would you be able to speak to a little bit about what you're kind of seeing coming out of AERA, or maybe even something that was a bigger data theme at the recent conference? It's just anything you're noticing in the literature, really.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today to say a few things. I guess a couple of things I was thinking about as we're coming off the AERA annual meeting and talking about data issues and all. I mean, you can take these existing data sets, for example, and conduct secondary analysis to address many questions in education research. I mean, for things around student achievement at all levels, think about questions around mathematics and science education, questions with parental involvement, students' educational trajectories, and graduate from high school, diplomas, and degree attainment, and then other things at the school level as well. I mean, just how schools are organized, curriculum and instruction questions, and things, school finance. Many of these types of questions are being addressed using these data sets. And even more specifically, that you can then also look at differences across race and ethnicity, different cultures, gender, that the data sets do allow you to do that in the secondary analysis. And then other things around even policies and practices too, and where there are measures that are described with secondary data. But I think one thing, though, Amber, what I will say here is to talk. One thing that seems to be very sort of new, or I'll say data innovations today, is that there's been an increase in data set linkages. So these are ways that we are now, as researchers, are combining two or more data sets to, for example, one thing can be where we talk about some of the survey data that exists. I think about data sets, say, from the National Center for Education Statistics, and these could be the data sets like the high school longitudinal study, or the educational longitudinal study, early childhood studies as well, and data from the National Assessment of Education Progress. So all these are designs, data sets that are nice and clean. I like to think about them because before they are released, the researchers they've really gone through and made sure that the data is user friendly, sort of near perfect for use. And so those data sets, and then as well as then you're able to you can take, say, for example, another design data set, something like the U.S. Census, for example, and maybe making those linkages where you are able to take something like the high school longitudinal study, for example, then match it to a census tract. And those are pretty clear, sort of that survey to survey, design data set to design data set. But then we're also seeing, though, a greater use of non-design data, or a lot of times people are talking about is big data. I think primarily things around some of the state longitudinal administrative data systems, or the SLADES data.
Mm-hmm.
So, and right now they're pretty much 48 states, I think, so right now have data that are available, their administrative data. And the federal government is helping to support the use of these data for research purposes. One thing about administrative data, this is big data in a sense with from schools, and this is a wealth of information about not only students and students' backgrounds and things that will be collected by the state. So in some places it could be something like a scores on a state assessment, for example. And in that could be in math and reading, science, it even, and drill down within an assessment. But you also might have information about that at the individual level, and that person, say, adult earnings, or in degree attainment, things of that nature can be all found within over time in big data. Information overall about a population and a community. Again, I talked about things about the census, but maybe there are other things you'd want to know about, say, if there's things around general socioeconomic tracts within a community, for example, in terms of, say, degree attainment in that community, or earnings. Just some examples here. But one thing about a lot of the administrative data is this big data is that it's often not in a good shape. It can be dirty in a sense too. So it may take a lot of time, sort of, in a sense, to kind of clean the data, so make it user friendly. I shouldn't say dirty, but that could be one of the biggest challenges, in that there's a lot of organizing that is needed before these data sets are able to be used for research purposes. Secondly, though, too, the same thing is if you're going to take non-design data, administrative data, and link it to any other data sets, be they design surveys or other non-design data sets, that there's still got to be a lot of cleaning and time that's going there and validating that, making sure that these matches, or you're getting exactly what you want. But researchers are doing this. I know you mentioned some things about the Stanford education data system, the SEDA data. That's an example of linking just various types of design and non-design data. People and there are new studies that are coming out. I know around the ABCD study, for example, is linking some of the SEDA data, the Stanford data as well. So there are many options there. And these data innovations are pretty neat, and we're learning. Researchers are now helping that you can learn so much more about people and trajectories. And one other thing that can be kind of neat about them is that you can get a larger swath of the population as well. And mean that, of course, weighting and sampling procedures and all may vary, but you'd also could focus on even parts of the population that, for example, if you were looking at a specific group, this could be a specific racial ethnic group or within a community, the researchers can have access to the entire population, and then to take a sample from there. So we're seeing all these things now, and I've been talking about a lot of quantitative kinds of analysis for statistical purposes, but there's also, if you talk about any other trends, so too, even around secondary analysis of some qualitative information. So studies around, and there are video data that's out there. I mean, you already talked about a little bit about measures of effective teaching, the metadata, where researchers are accessing some of this data and then analyzing and conducting a secondary analysis. Other studies have, there has been focus group data that's available, or maybe there is information about a curriculum specifically. So there are many options. We're just seeing right now. I mean, just if it's graduate students, and as well as senior researchers, really doing really neat things, innovative things with data.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And it really kind of supports the idea of the high quality secondary data for analysis. It's to the point where we have such a plethora and a diversity and a variety of data out there that covers a large amount of variables and populations. And now we're at the point where we can start linking these data sets and answering new questions and being able to move our research along in that area. So it's a very good point. And as you mentioned before, the qualitative data is equally as important. And I'll share a few links to several repositories as well with that. So we've been talking a lot about these data and these data linkages and things that are innovative. And I really want to give Allison a chance to tell us about her experience working with College and Beyond too, what some of that data linkage looked like. Maybe if you could speak to some of the challenges that you all had when you're trying to link across two different data sets. I saw someone mention that question in the Q&A, so you might be able to get to that a little bit. But if you could just tell us a little bit about College and Beyond 2, why it's unique, and what we can get from it as education researchers.
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, it's just great to be speaking with all of you today and talking about education data. We're talking about good stuff, primary, secondary data, FERPA, all these kind of issues that we've been grappling with. And also at one point, definitely want to talk about College and Beyond 2 in terms of the fact that it's restricted data. I think that's really important for understanding the landscape of access to education data. Yeah, first, as you said, Amber, I should summarize what College and Beyond 2 is. So as you mentioned, it's a series of data that researchers can use to study higher education, both the experience of it and its impact. So the people who planned College and Beyond 2 decided really the best way to collect data for the project was to use rich administrative data that colleges already have, right? So colleges collect tons of information on students, along the way of us earning our degrees and taking courses. So this includes application data, student enrollment records, and student transcripts. There's a ton of data and transcripts about courses students take, credits that they earn, the pace and scale of which they take their coursework, majors, et cetera, that can really tell us a lot about the educational experience. So going back to what George was saying about designed and non-designed data, basically what the researchers decided to do was take this kind of organic, non-designed data that colleges were collecting and basically kind of take it and use it for research purposes. So what we did was we put all this data together. And so we have the transcript data. We also have descriptions of the courses students took. We have National Student Clearinghouse data, which lets us know what degrees students earned in their enrollment periods. We also have the survey that Amber mentioned earlier of alumni, and that provides us outcomes on a subsample of the students in the administrative data about 10 years after they graduate from college. So it's really comprehensive and very detailed data, and we put it all together, linking it. Amber, as you mentioned, that can be challenging to kind of put all the data together. The biggest issue for us was actually standardizing the data. So that is a part of the process of when you have this primary data and you're trying to turn it into secondary data for other people to use. You know, as George mentioned, and when it's administrative, it's often dirty, it's not in good shape. Not to mention when you're taking data from 19 different colleges, it's often not recorded in the same way. So we had the challenge of trying to figure out ways to standardize this data so that, for instance, the way College A named and numbered their courses would be the same as College B. Because if we didn't standardize these naming and numbering systems, when researchers went in to use transcript data, it would be overwhelming. You'd have just all different kinds of names and numbers, and how would you know if, you know, this one course over here that covers Introduction to Education, Teaching and Learning is the same as this college over here that has that same class but calls it something different. So a ton of the work that we put into this data and getting it ready for secondary use was a lot of that, just really making things the same across colleges in terms of the terms and what they were called and enrollment dates and so many different things. And then another thing that we spent a lot of time on was really kind of de-identifying the data and making sure that it was ready to be shared with others. So what that means is we took out all of the direct identifiers. If you use the College and Beyond 2 data, you will not see anyone's name, student ID, address, anything that could directly identify them or a college. So that means taking out all references to the college's names, as well as things like their mascots, anything that could directly tie back to an institution. So the data has been de-identified, and that means we're able to share it with researchers. However, it's still incredibly rich. Despite being de-identified, you know, as I mentioned, there's a lot in there. And that richness provides both kind of opportunities, right, and great power. You can really do some really detailed analyses, really kind of drilling down into the mechanisms of how education works and for whom and in what ways. But it's kind of one of those situations with great power comes great responsibility. So I think I want to take a minute and just kind of really delve into why College and Beyond 2 is restricted and why data like College and Beyond 2 is restricted. So we can extrapolate from this to lots of other types of restricted educational data. Let's talk about
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? When you
Sure.
said it was de-identified, so is there any geographical or regional information that you can tell?
There is some limited, nothing that would directly point to an individual at the level of, say, a street address. That information is not in there. But we do have information at the zip code level. That is the lowest that we go, which does allow researchers to be able to link to contextual data on communities, and is another reason why College and Beyond 2 is a restricted data set. So not only is it rich, but it allows for researchers to do some of that linkage to contextual information that's so important for understanding educational processes, but again, kind of goes back to all of that data. There needs to be some precautions in place to ensure that no one can be re-identified during the course of using that data. So yeah, that would be the main geographical linkage, would be zip code.
That's still pretty good. Joe, did you want to jump in there?
I just wanted to comment, the direct identifiers are of course gone, but there are indirects present, like zip code. That is it de-identified by FERPA standards? Yes. Is there enough there that we feel that it needs to be treated as restricted data? Still, also yes.
Gotcha.
And we're pretty comfortable with that. We also have data as part of CB2. Allison, am I supposed to talk about this? That's not de-identified, but we're not giving it out that way.
Oh yeah, the project team has personally identifiable information just for the purposes of linkage and quality control, but researchers do not have access to that data.
Curating the data sets.
Gotcha.
And some of the data is qualitative, which also makes things complex.
Right. So I think just in terms of kind of broadening this out to the audience and folks who are trying to kind of make sense of all the data that's available, the challenges that it might pose and the benefits of using different types of data, I think would be really good to talk about kind of the benefits of using restricted data. Like, why would you want to seek out restricted data, given that there are some challenges and costs to using it, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the first one really is that richness. So, the level of detail that you can get with restricted use data means, again, that you can analyze things on a much more granular basis, getting into mechanisms, and really looking at experiences of, intersectional groups, for instance. So, for instance, like using College and Beyond 2 as an example, you can do things like examine math course taking trajectories for like all students in a major, from college entry to completion, right? Like the richness and the detail in that. Where in comparison, a public access data set might only have, like, for instance, the ones available from NCES might only have like aggregate measures of math course taking, or maybe the highest math course a student took during college, or maybe some other kind of course or indicators, right? So you're kind of doing this trade-off with the richness of restricted data versus kind of the more aggregate or coarser measures that are publicly available data. So another really key benefit of restricted data, why you might want to seek access to it, is because it gives you access to sensitive or proprietary data that you otherwise could not have. So for instance, in the case of College and Beyond 2, these colleges shared data with the study and made it available for reuse to researchers across the world. Usually though, you cannot get access to an institution's data unless you are a researcher at that institution. And even then it can be challenging. So for instance, at the University of Michigan, I can apply for access to University of Michigan data. And if I do certain things and have a certain justification, I might be able to use it. But I can't just email Michigan State University and say, hey, I really want to examine, your data and look at the impact of a policy that you had, because I'm not affiliated with Michigan State. So I think this is a really key thing, because oftentimes people are frustrated about the steps they have to take to get access to restricted data, right? There's people think about it like, oh, I have to jump through all these hoops and it's hard and it's frustrating. But really, that's actually kind of a fallacy if you think about it. So those hoops, if they weren't in place, people would not be able to have access to the data at all. So it is really that's a key benefit of restricted data, is that you can even have it in the first place, just because there are mechanisms in place to kind of ensure that only the people who are prepared and will use the data responsibly will have access to sensitive or proprietary data. And then a third benefit really is that it takes effort to get to restricted data, right? It's not easy. You can't just download it. You have to apply. And to be honest, this results in fewer people using it. And lower levels of use means more open questions to explore with the data. So some people are worried about research ideas being scooped, or that you might, be using a data set that other people are using as well. Using restricted data does lower the chance that others are using the exact same data in the exact same way you are, just because fewer people go through the steps of gaining access, to be honest. But now I want to talk a little bit about the less fun part, which is kind of, okay, this is great to get access to this really detailed data, but again, with this great responsibility comes, or this great power comes great responsibility. You'll need to demonstrate that you have the mindset in place and you're doing the right things in order to keep this data confidential. And so depending on the data provider and the data itself, you might be asked to do several things. I can list a couple here. For instance, you will probably have to justify their use of the data to the data provider, right? So you'll have to either write some sort of application or a written project description describing why you need to use this data. In the case of College and Beyond 2, you'll provide this justification as part of your online restricted data application to ICPSR. You'll probably also need to agree to uphold data confidentiality and security. So maybe taking an online training or something like that, some sort of training, or signing a data security plan. You will likely also need to be part of an organization that is willing to take responsibility for your actions. And most likely this will be your college or university. This often requires getting a data use agreement signed by your organization and the data provider. Also consulting your IRB, as Joe mentioned earlier. And you'll also likely need to use the data in a special secure place. So this could be a virtual data enclave, like where the College and Beyond 2 data is located. Could be a special physical enclave, like for instance, the census uses in many cases. And then finally, you might need to have your research products reviewed prior to dissemination to double check that no one can be re-identified through your research output. In the case of College and Beyond 2 and ICPSR, your output is vetted before it's pulled out of a virtual enclave. With the case of NCES, for instance, you have to send your data products to NCES and have them review them and kind of stamp them with approval before you disseminate. So there's lots of different ways this is done, but just know that, again, you have to demonstrate you have the responsibility to work with this data by taking certain steps to really ensure that you treat the data with the kind of the kid gloves it deserves, being as detailed as it is. So I will stop here because I'm sure there are plenty of questions. I don't want to take up any more time, but I'm happy to answer any questions about restricted data, as are others, I'm sure, on the panel, or College and Beyond 2 in particular, if people have questions.
Thank you, Allison. I always learn something new, right? I appreciate it. So one of the questions that popped up, it kind of goes along with what you were mentioning at the end, and something that popped up in my mind when you were talking about the protection, and you mentioned using it with kid-like gloves. And then I thought, I said, these are college students. They're not even, the most vulnerable of the education folks that, the children that we do research on. So one of the questions that came into the comments was, where can you find de-identified K-12 information? Does it exist? If it doesn't, why or why not? Does anybody have any experience with getting something like that, de-identified K-12 data?
Well, I'm a higher education researcher by trade, so I'll take just a stab here, and I'm sure others could have way more detail than I do. When I think of K-12 data and de-identified student level data, I do think of the NCES data. And so that seems like that would be a good place to start. They obviously have several longitudinal studies, on various age groups that span multiple time periods. And so I would suggest that. Other options include state longitudinal data systems that often follow students through their entire educational career, beginning, kind of at the earliest points of public education. And that would be another way. Many states do provide access to researchers, provide de-identified data access to researchers to work with that data as well.
I was just add there, Allison, right? You've got now NCS data, contacting NCS directly with your questions, where they can help guide you to which data sets might be appropriate. Another thing is, so I know we have a lot of graduate students that are probably on and on to usually these webinars. And as you're thinking about this, you might say, oh, wow, there are all these data sets, especially on those that are publicly available, but I don't know how to work with them by myself, or this is not really directly what my advisor is working with. But one of the neat things is that with these data sets is that there are communities all over the country where people are using these data sets. So that's where things, even with the Peers Data Hub, people can connect, and maybe it is things where people are sharing code, for example. Others have used these in articles, things. You can see how they coded data. So in a sense that it's sort of a double-edged sword, since you have all these people who are working with this, and you're going to bring something new to the table, but at the same time you have a community of people who can help you along with questions if there's not someone, like say, readily available on your campus. And of course, if you're fortunate enough to you're working on a study with restricted data, which is great. That is often through a faculty member. There's so many neat questions and things that you can examine. As you're talking about educational trajectories, and if you are making some of those linkages, I mean, even zip code is quite a valuable measure to link to. So it really just opens up so many options.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I will speak to one experience on a project that I was working on. We were trying to develop, and I know we're pushing the end, so I'll make this short. We were trying to see if we could find a cumulative deficit index if students were chronically assigned to teachers with less experience. So we did go to a school district in Charlotte, and we let them know what we were looking for. And they were able to find about 300 students that stayed in the district from 3rd to 8th grade, and they tracked their student ID to which teacher they were assigned to, even if they moved to a different school. So it had to be student level, because we needed to know which teacher the student was assigned to, so that we could, and then we needed to know the teacher's information. And we used the teacher's hire date, when they entered the district. Like, we had to come up with a lot of different mechanisms to try to standardize. Apologize, my dog. But that was one way I was able to get K-12 information de-identified on students. Excuse me. Well, I will not keep us too much longer. I do want to share a few more slides with you all before we get out of here today, just so you can follow up with us at the Peers Data Hub if you're interested in learning more. So let me share our information for takeaway today. We go on the Zoom. So again, we have, oh no, sorry. Play from current slides. We have a form that you all can use if you have questions and you want to bring them to the Peers Data Hub. This QR code will be on the slides when we share them with you. The Peers Data Hub likes to stay open as a sort of help desk to you. If you have questions that we weren't able to answer today, please reach out to us or me directly. Again, the Peers Data Hub is a one-stop shop for your educational research. You can come and discover secondary data sets. We have over 170. You can connect with like-minded researchers, and you can also learn about how to manage your data a little bit better. Please subscribe on the subscribers list and visit our website if you want to learn more, and also register for webinars such as this. Thank you all again so much. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the future.